first of all, thank you again. I really appreciate it. And I wanted, before I ask you specifically about Eye of the Storm, I wanted to just see if we could do sort of one of these career look backs. And to begin with, preparing for this, I read that TV came very late to the area where you grew up, and also movies weren't a huge part of your childhood. So where did you first see performance? Where did first cross paths?
No, I saw films as a child.
Yeah.
But television came to Australia in Sydney in 1956, and it was 1959 when it came to Queensland. So I was 8.
Okay.
I think it started in the States like in the late 40s.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was a big cultural shift, television coming into any culture, you know what I mean? No, what I saw was in my childhood, I sometimes wrongfully disparage what I call the cultural wasteland of Australia in the middle of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
But relative to the global picture, it was a kind of a backwater. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Our film industry had been moribund for decades, since the 30s, Australia in the silent film era, in the very, our biggest year of Australian film production was in 1911. We put out like 40 feature films or something, you know what I mean? This is, but with American distribution and so forth, taking up the global market, we'd sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there were the occasional offshore productions from the UK and so forth, but there wasn't a lot there. I mean, that impacted on me most when I was in my senior year at high school. I was very actively involved in the school drama club, and as students we ended up running it ourselves. There were no drama teachers. I think the reason for that was that the very nice English teacher and the art teacher that had initially got us interested in putting on plays at lunchtime, they moved on or got married or something, so we said, hey, we'll take it over ourselves. But in that senior year at high school in 1968, Michael Powell, the great English director, who kind of got sent like a convict to the colonies because of Peeping Tom, this film that he made in the early 60s. He made 2 films in Australia, one called They're a Weird Mob, which was a kind of very interesting kind of a Italian migrant story, comedy set in Sydney. And then in 68, when I was at high school, I read in the paper they were shooting a film up on the Queensland coast with James Mason and a very young Helen Mirren, based on a Norman Lindsay, who was a great painter and novelist from the 20s in Australia, called Age of Consent. And in my mind and all of my friends at school, it made no sense that they were actually making a film in Queensland. Do you know what I mean? There was no precedent for it, so we never thought about that. But in my childhood, I saw, before TV arrived, when I was 5, 6, 7, the very dying days of travelling vaudeville tent shows, where they would do a variety show by night. This was in a big tent with a canvas proscenium arch down one end, with magicians, sight acts, blue comedians. I don't know whether you use the term blue here, risque, adult humour, you know what I mean? And by day they would do the English tradition or the Australian version of pantomimes like Jack and the Beanstalk or Cinderella or whatever. And simultaneously in Toowoomba, which is a relatively small town up on the mountain range west of Brisbane, they had an annual, they still do, the Carnival of Flowers, and that would always start with this massive street parade of floats and marching bands and jugglers and clowns and whatever, which in my childhood memory is sort of like better than anything that Fellini ever made, and I was a great Fellini fan, always have been, So they were the sort of early things. So there's always something there. Just when you think, well, we didn't have a film industry or we didn't have major dominant theatre in our lives and stuff like that, there's always something there that sparks particular young imaginations.
Absolutely. Well, I read again that you had when you went off to university, you did some theater, but also then went on and did miming and movement study and stuff like that, which I wonder, it's got to in some ways trace back to those childhood things that you encountered. Wouldn't that be the case?
Yeah, when I was at university, it was a fairly active political era, a lot of cultural change going on, a countercultural movement, late 60s, early 70s. So I got involved with a fairly heavy group of, artists and Trotskyites and God knows who else, putting on weird and wonderful plays. And during that time, the Queensland Theatre Company was formed, and they'd seen my work and some of my colleagues at university, and we were offered jobs, and suddenly I'm putting actor on my tax form going, this is kind of... I didn't really expect this to happen. I thought I'd end up in radio or teaching or, whatever you think the avenues might be. Mm-hmm. It was interesting hearing Fred talk in the last round tables we were doing, and he's 11 or 12 years my senior, and he said in the mid-50s, he said all of his artistic orientated mates, writers, painters, whatever, all worked in advertising because that was the only umbrella where they could find some kind of creative outlet.
Interesting. Well, when you now it became your career, and the way the story's been told since you sort of shot to prominence in the U.S., I guess with Shine, the narrative was, here's this guy who's been a great actor but sort of never really appreciated for all these years. He's been 25 years prior, I guess, working in Australia. And I just wonder when I hear that, if that is how you saw it, and also, just the sense that those years, was it fulfilling to be a working actor, or was there a sense that you needed something, you were hoping for something more beyond that?
No, the goal was, from my early 20s onwards, thinking, I know I've entered a fairly peripatetic kind of industry. I hope it has continuity and opportunities keep arising, which they did, mm-hmm. and part of that involved some risk-taking. The reason I went to the school to study in Paris was because I suppose there was a sort of interstate rivalry between regional Brisbane and dirty Sodom and Gomorrah Sydney, you know what I mean, if I can put it that way, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I felt, having done 3 years in a repertory company, that I'd found out a little bit about who I was as an actor, and during that time I knew that I'd been encouraged through different training workshops or characters that I'd created that I had a bent for a physical kind of attitude to my work. And I'd done a workshop with a graduate from that school, and he said, you've got a really good feel for this. And he said, this is one of the great creative training institutions to go to. And I had a certain Europhile sort of intellectual sensibility. Mm-hmm. We all did in that period, I think. And the kind of films that we were going to see, whether they were, a lot of Italian films really appealed to me, Visconti and Fellini and, so forth. So there was a strong pull towards Europe, less so to England. The generation before me, like in this film of The Eye of the Storm, yes. the Basil Hunters of the world, all migrated to England.
Yeah.
But there was, and it could go back to those childhood impulses that I was looking for something more expressionistic maybe, rather than just text-based classical traditions or something.
Another thing, though, that was written about, as I look back at articles from around the time of Shine, though, was people, I guess, were either reading into things you had said, or I don't know, but they had said, right before you got the script for Shine, they were saying you had sort of almost like panic attacks, or...
Yeah. Can we wind back from that moment
sure.
a little bit? I was only thinking of this recently because I'm about to go into a commercial production in in Melbourne of a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. And I suddenly thought, gosh, apart films aside, in all of that 25 years of theatre, I think when I did Exit the King on Broadway and this upcoming musical is the only time I've worked commercially, because the setup in Australia, particularly for the not that there aren't commercial productions, they're mostly musicals. It's very rare to have commercial productions of straight plays. I was a subsidized theatre actor, so it could be, I don't know, the American equivalent might be working off-Broadway or something like that, and people I know, very notable actors on Broadway, maybe are not household names, but they have 25-year careers, and they have risen up through the ranks or whatever, you know what I mean? They've established their identity within the theatre-going community. So and it was not really part of our culture then to, there were, I suppose in the 70s and 80s, there started to emerge household names through television in Australia, or with comedy shows or drama or whatever. And again, around that period when the film industry kick-started again, there were a handful of names that became celebrated. But I was always working in a kind of not exclusively classically orientated repertoire. There was a great mixture of stuff, but doing it was of enormous satisfaction. And I never looked with any form of envy at some of my colleagues who were working in the movies, even though I always loved the movies, because most of the roles that I thought I could possibly play in films just didn't match up to, like, it would be a little support part here or a little cameo role. Because I was being offered Figaro in Beaumarchais' play. You know what I mean? I was looking for different creative challenges. And then suddenly a couple of films came along in the mid-90s, one being Shine and one being Children of the Revolution, and the other one being this film called On Our Selection. And I did 3 of them back to back, and I went, oh wow, these roles are different to the kind of slightly more pioneering. Australia seemed to make a lot of films where you had to be on horseback, you know what I mean? That's a bit overstated, really.
But so, as far as those suggestions that there was concern, or not concern, but worry about it, is this the right path still when I have now a family or all that? The panic attacks.
No, they coincided. Yeah. Around about the time I was 40, I'd been working for 20 odd years, and I hit a bit of a brick wall in terms of exhaustion, because I was a bit of a workaholic, and I had non-stop offers and potential, so I wasn't taking enough downtime, you know what I mean, which is kind of, sometimes for the nature of the intensity of the work, it's a good thing to do. And I went through a period where I had terrible kind of panic disorder for a couple of years and stuff. That could have been work-related, could have been life-related, could have been... it wasn't really, 92 was the last year that I did maybe 7 or 8 plays in a year, you know what I mean? Right. And then my daughter was born, and then I started to think seriously, and then I was waiting for Shine. Right. So all these things, I waited 3 years for Shine to officially get green lit. Right. Because I thought, this is a pretty good role, and I think I can bring something to it,
Did you ever think when you first read it, well, I guess the first question is, how did it first come to you, but also when you saw it, was it immediately clear that this was going to be something very special, or did you have to just sort of experience it to realize that it was going to connect with people the way that it did?
I had no scale of what its outcome would be, and to this day I never really overly envision where a project is going to go. It's hard to pick them, something like Shakespeare in Love, I thought, look, there's a nice pedigree, there's amazing actors in this, but it'll be, if it fires, it'll be a nice little neat art house kind of folly, you know what I mean? And it ended up being a date movie for people, you know. No, with Shine, I just read it and thought, this is a very good part, a great part, and a kind of, I don't know, having played, there were probably tangentially a number of roles I'd done on stage, whether it's Lear's Fool or I liked the idea that he was in a milieu where he was a classical pianist. That broke a certain stereotype of what an Australian character could be, you know what I mean? There weren't that many piano-playing Australian characters that were written about.
Right.
It just felt like I felt emotionally and intellectually attuned to being able to, and also frightened by it, because, you know, I'd met the guy and he was still alive, and I knew it was a very layered, complex sort of role that had to be honoured.
Would you say
honestly, you know?
Would you say that you prepared for that one more or differently than in other cases? Because I mean, just a few of the things I had seen were that, you know, the listening to the tapes to get the speech.
Yeah.
And
well, that was by default
lessons.
Because again, it was the time frame. You know, suddenly there were close to 3 years of getting a phone call every 3 months, going, it's been postponed. They can't get the financing in place. We're talking $4 million or something, you know what I mean?
A lot of people missed an opportunity.
Yeah. But and it was around that time when my daughter was born, and then I had more time off because I was waiting, so I wouldn't take theatre jobs, and I spent time at home with my baby and all that sort of stuff. And it was around that time that I started to think, oh God, you know, even though I had regular work within the subsidised, you know, government-funded theatre world, you didn't end up with much small change from 15 grand a year or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I thought, gee, I got to think about college fees and have a 20-year plan now, rather than selfishly thinking about what will I be doing next season. Mm-hmm. And during that period, I went through like 5 callbacks for The Engineer when they were doing big commercial production. Cameron McIntosh was doing Miss Saigon in Sydney. And I got down to the final 2 callbacks, you know what I mean? And then Shine got greenlit, and it all sort of went into another direction. So,
well, that I guess is the next obvious question. Just when this movie clicked as it did, is there a specific moment that you remember where you sort of knew it was a hit and things were not going to be the same for you? I mean, when did you know it was good, and then when did you know for yourself that it was going to be different?
There were tiny moments that became fascinating markers along the journey, because it was a very slow fuse. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I probably spent from the time that it premiered at a festival, I can't even think where the Australian premiere was. I think it was in Adelaide. And I don't know whether it was under a film festival banner, but it sort of went through a number of festivals in Sydney and Melbourne and so forth. And that would have started around, I don't know, May or June in '96. So between that period and its journey to the Oscars in late March, it was 8 months or something, you know what I mean? But there were a couple of fascinating things for me where I remember coming to New York on a very initial press junket in September in '96, where we went to a number of really interesting small festivals like Mill Valley and New Orleans and Denver, and we came through New York and did press and all of that. And I had a wonderful time. I thought, nothing to lose here. This is great. You know. and kind of witnessing a fascinating response, you know, from another culture about this film. And then Fine Line, who was distributing it, would phone me up and say, look, you've been nominated for a Golden Satellite, I don't know, or a Golden Globe or something. No, it was the press things. It was the New York Film Critics and the LA Film Critics. And they would say, look, on the strength of that, we've just gone up a notch, and we know we can get better outlets. You'll be less on the road. There's more buzz created. It's still very tiny. Who knows? It might fizzle out. We don't know. So I commuted maybe for the next 2 months around November, December. I probably commuted to and from the States about 8 times. It was like once a fortnight I would be coming across. And I just remember in that period once standing outside a downtown restaurant in New York, and the film was on in the Lincoln Plaza and the Angelica Center. Yeah. And a guy walked past me outside a restaurant and went, "Hey, loved your movie." And I thought, I'm a Sydney stage actor, and some guy in New York on the street. You know what I mean? I'm a completely anonymous figure in this town. Right. 2 weeks later, I come back, and a college student comes up to me at the airport and says, "Excuse me, Mr. Rush, I saw your film, and congratulations. I wish you the best. That was I study piano, and it meant a lot to me," and blah, blah, blah. And I went, wow. 2 weeks later, I come back. There's a guy cleaning at the airport who goes, "Hey, piano man." You know what I mean? And they were the most interesting times.
That's awesome.
To feel, I learned a lot from the Fine Line team about the judicious experimental marketing, which has now become, even in the subsequent 16 years, maybe an overworked and over-psyched science.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
But in those days, it was the beginnings of, because that was the year suddenly independent films were the flavor of the month. And,
absolutely.
You know, Billy Crystal had great jokes about that. We all had to show passports to get into Oscars, whatever.
So one final thing about Shine, and then I promise we'll move on, but I just think it's such a kind of obviously a turning point. There are certain people who an Oscar, changes everything for them, and certain people who say, years later it did nothing for me. Obviously, it seems like it was the former for you. Can you, how did it most impact your life? I guess you now are a Hollywood actor as well. Is that a way to look at it?
I don't know. In that particular era, I think for all the actors who I was traveling with, like an Emily Watson on Breaking the Waves or whatever, or the Brenda Blethyn in Secrets and Lies, do you know what I mean? Yeah. I think we all kind of went, oh, this is nice, it's great coming to LA and going to the press junket in New York and blah, 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 but probably go back home and pick up on theatre work or whatever, because it didn't feel like they wasn't the right demo reel for generally what was being made in the industry.
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, I've told people this one before, but someone did offer me a script for Liberace, which I always thought was hilarious. That they thought, he could bring a piano playing film to life. I think this could be. I mean, in the old days, people could make substantial careers out of being cops all the time or being cowboys. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It's a great tradition in American filmmaking, but piano playing,
it's quite a niche.
Yeah.
But okay, so after that, and what I hope we can do, and it's not even fair to you or these movies, but I just wonder if I can run off a few, just the thing that most stands out in your memory as you think back to the experience of making it or the way it was received. But I guess the next big one, as you mentioned earlier, would have been Shakespeare in Love. Maybe Elizabeth. I don't know what the chronology. I know they were both 98, but I don't know which came first. But
they came out together.
Did they? Okay.
Yeah, I remember they must have both come out like November. Mm-hmm. '98 or something like that.
Yeah.
And again, I think, Working Title and Miramax probably offered me those parts because I was a name on the table then for having the statue.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure, they wouldn't have heard of me. They might have seen the movie, but that they went. I did them because I loved that period, and I thought these are, and they were, curiously enough, they ended up becoming, for me, quite good companion pieces. They were both Elizabethan films. One was a comedy and one was dramatic.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And it was like I was back in a repertory theatre company where we're rehearsing Pal Joey by day and doing Beaumarchais' Marriage of Figaro by night. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that felt comfortable for me. And I thought both films, no one had had a hit with an Elizabethan-themed film since Man for All Seasons or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and now you got it too.
And they both made a nice cultural impact, it seems. So,
and Best Picture Oscar, pretty cool. And I just was thinking, it didn't even occur to me, but both of the Best Picture Oscar winners, you and Colin Firth were together in, I guess, for Shakespeare in Love and King's Speech,
maybe.
and Harvey Weinstein. So
a remake of Twins.
That's right. So, and then Quills, I guess that would be 2 years or maybe a year or two after that. To be at the center of a movie. Well, it feels like that one, maybe as much as any of the Hollywood made or American era movies, let you go, sort of show all your colors as an actor in a way. You were so,
The most significant thing for that was initially meeting Phil Kaufman. I was a huge fan of The Right Stuff, and sort of going to meet him to say, look, I'm doing this as a kind of gentlemanly duty because I'd really like to meet you, and he'd invited me for lunch and whatever. But it was to say, look, I'm the wrong guy for the role because, at that stage, I said, you really Brando, this is Brando's role because it needed a man of a certain physical bulk at that point and of a certain age. And then he kind of went, no, it's going to be more from the angle of the way Desaad might have imagined himself as the hero in one of his own rather perverse novels. Do you know what I mean? I want to see the rangy, scrawny, intellectual writer with insane appetites on all levels. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, that's kind of interesting. And Doug Wright's screenplay was, it had come out of a theatrical background. The intensity and the brilliance of language and argument and debate in that script, I just thought, this is too irresistible,
That's great. So then, throughout the past decade, intermittently, you've had these, whereas a lot of these movies that we've talked about had sort of art house audiences, which was great. Suddenly, you're now in Pirates of the Caribbean, and I bet even that, just the experience of making it, and then afterwards, after having been in a movie like that, was it just completely unlike anything else?
Well, yeah, the scale of it, certainly. But there was a nice healthy, risky edge to the first chapter of those 4 films. Because historically, it had been 5 decades since people had had a hit movie, what was going out as a kind of summer tentpole. There was a kind of black X on the success of pirate films, Again, I really loved the script. Ted Elliott, Terry Rossio, no slouches when it comes to constructing a nice narrative and a vast array of eccentric characters, double acts. They said to me once, we tried to write it as if we're writing for the old days at Hollywood, at Warner Brothers, where you would have regular character actors on the lot. You could say there's a great comedy duo there. They could play these parts,
Right.
you know. And,
Pull them up, yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure. Jerry Bruckheimer must have had great confidence in it. But, you know, it was... In that season, we were very low down on the list of what's coming up this summer.
Right.
It sort of snuck up on everyone. And again, it was one of those things where I thought, you know, because I'd been in this film Mystery Men, which I adored making, and it was with an extraordinary group of very diverse, creative people. And I thought, you know, in the wake of the big, scary summer tentpoles like Deep Impact and Armageddon and Independence Day, I thought a ratbag comedy about a lot of wannabe... It was the first sort of slacker superhero action film, you know what I mean?
It's a good way of putting it.
And in 2 weeks it was dead in the water, so you never know. That was a bit of a lesson to go. I thought, oh, this may be the one where I can get an action figure to show my kids to say, look, how cool is this?
So, final one in the list leading up to the present is probably, for a lot of people, of all of your roles, maybe their favorite, one of them, and of course, King's Speech. And I just have to ask, you know, the story, I've heard the truncated versions of it, but a script just shows up at your front door?
Yeah.
That's not the conventional way of going about doing that, is it?
No, that's what happened. It was a theatre group in London who had the play script version, and they, very nicely in a way, had alerted me to the fact that there was this Australian character and they were trying to get it up as a stage production. And I mentioned it to my agent and said, look, I actually think this could be a very, very interesting film. It just feels as though it's got certain templates that would be very filmic, you know, particularly for the intimacy of that central relationship between the therapist and the king. I was mostly interested in it because it was an international story that featured a very different kind of Australian, non-stereotypical Australian personality. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And a sort of based on a real guy, but we knew nothing about him. I remember Googling Lionel Logue then and found one minor reference to on the Australian Speech Therapist Association website that mentioned him in one sentence.
Oh my goodness.
You Google his name now and it's like...
It's everywhere. So how did you know what to do?
Because in the final days leading up to the, maybe, I don't know, 6 weeks before we went into principal photography, the art department met his grandson, who said, oh, I've got a whole lot of my grandfather's papers and letters and photographs and stuff, and his diaries.
God.
And it was like a treasure trove. It was extraordinary.
All right, so to bring this to up to date, last night we had the, I guess, New York premiere. It had been in Toronto of Eye of the Storm. Mm-hmm. For you, it sounds like it was a very kind of personal in a lot of ways, and I want to just put out the facts and then ask you to talk about. But it seems like Fred Shepsey's somebody you've always admired.
Yeah.
Charlotte Rampling, somebody you've always had a crush on.
Yeah.
and Judy Davis is somebody that you made your first film with. Is that?
Yeah,
was that Hoodwink?
Hoodwink, but we didn't actually have scenes together. But I knew Judy around the traps in the theatre and through mutual friends and stuff, and was always kind of in awe of her amazing film debut in My Brilliant Career. You know what I mean? Kind of nailed it. And then she'd gone off and worked with David Lean and got Oscar nominated. Right. So that was one of the markers, one of the key markers in the Australian film story, where she was like played a very significant role, you know, in terms of being nominated for Passage to India and stuff like that.
So with all of those things, I guess Fred Shepsey, it's people know him probably best for Cry in the Dark and Roxanne and stuff, but for you, why was he such a hero? Because it sounds like he really, in a lot of ways...
Well, his first two films, I saw them when I was studying in Paris. and that whole film explosion kind of happened when I left Australia. Suddenly I'm in England and studying then in Paris. I start to hear about all these Australian films that are coming out, you know, and I went and saw Devil's Playground and Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. And they're sort of masterpieces, do you know what I mean? They are, to this day they hold up. As we had a retrospective screening of Jimmy Blacksmith at the Melbourne Film Festival a few years ago.
Nice.
And it was extraordinary to watch a cinema of about 400 or 500 20 to 30-year-old film buffs who go to this showcase festival, sitting there with their jaws down here going, oh my God, we didn't know, you know, maybe a little part of that generation gets a little bit of cultural amnesia about what happened in the olden days,
right.
you know, like the 70s.
I think it's and everywhere though, not only Australia, people just short.
And they were taken aback by the power and the dramatic impact and the filmic assuredness of this, you know, cinematic mind. But I, you know, since those films I did in Australia in the mid-90s, I've been lucky enough, I suppose, I've always wanted to, you know, because I live there as well. Mm-hmm. I want to be able to sometimes get up in the town I live in and go to work rather than get on a plane and go across the planet to work. But you know, I've been fortunate to have found some roles that I found very kind of interesting and challenging to take on, with Lantana or with Candy, with Brand New Day. You know what I mean? There have been a number of Australian films that have kept me very much on my toes and kind of not pigeonholing myself into just doing a job because it's an Australian film. So when something like Eye of the Storm comes up, you know, I'd been in Patrick White's later plays and knew him in the last part of his life. The combination of Fred wanting to do that with Judy, you know, I just went, we have to take this on. I don't know what the end result is going to be because Patrick's novelistic style is very dense. I mean, it's in the tradition of Joyce and Marquez and D.H. Lawrence. Do you know what I mean? It's the way novels used to be written, still are, but you know, of a certain 20th century tradition. And I thought that if anyone's going to kind of bring this to some kind of interesting fruition on the screen, it'll be someone like Fred. Chiefly because of John Guare was there last night, which was great to see him. I'd met him before. He'd come to see Exit the King when I was in New York. Fred's film of 6 Degrees of Separation, such a originally a highly theatrical piece, you know, with direct address to the audience and techniques that were very much of the theatre, which Fred, without putting any obvious signature or fingerprints all over it, turned into a very elegant cinematic view of Upper East Side New York. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I went, wow, there's a real mastery in that.
So the very last question, I promise, is this. It's now been 16 years, I guess, since Shine, and sort of the change in your life and career and all of that. In that time, it seems that you have gone from being sort of boxed as a character actor to being this Oscar, winning actor, to being, in this film even a sex symbol, sex magnet, to being
a sad one,
and Australian of the Year now apparently. So congratulations first of all, but just with these, could you have fathomed this if in 1995 somebody said this is what's to come?
No, my sister and Mum came to the Australian of the Year ceremony, which is a kind of a big deal in Canberra.
Sure.
You're presented by the Prime Minister and all of this sort of stuff. And my sister said, do you have to pinch yourself sometimes? And I said, of course. It's just like, on some levels it's almost slightly absurd and slightly happening to another person. Do you know what I mean? It's a strange detachment. But with something like Australian of the Year, they've only ever given it in the last 50 years that it's been around. It's normally someone in a fairly high public profile. A lot of sports people, politicians, scientists, etc. They've only ever given it to two actors of film or theatre. One was Sir Robert Helpman back in the 60s, and one was Paul Hogan back in the 80s. So I took their honour quite seriously on behalf of all of my colleagues in the industry, because just in terms of visibility and credibility within our culture, it doesn't hurt to give the arts a slightly more, a bit of a leg up, you know. And it does, as I said last night, it's a kind of hat you get to wear at various events, you know. So even when I was shooting this film in Italy earlier this year, and one of the makeup guys had worked, he's an Italian makeup guy, and he'd worked on Great Gatsby for Baz down in Sydney. And he said, I heard you became Australian of the Year. This is great that your country honours their artists and so forth. And I said, well, they don't overtly do that in a constant, you know, overwhelming sort of way. But yes, they did, and it's kind of, I think, it's a nice little symbol on some level.
Very deserved, and I really appreciate doing this. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.